So, it's my genuine pleasure to introduce Wally Adeyemo, who is the Deputy Treasury Secretary. His previous roles, which are all remarkable, included Deputy National Security Advisor and Deputy Director of the NEC, Senior Advisor and Chief of Staff of the Treasury Department, Chief Negotiator for the macro provisions of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He also spent time at BlackRock as Senior Advisor and Chief of Staff to the CEO, and in 2019 was selected to be the first president of the Obama administration. Obama Foundation. They already had a president of the Obama administration. And of course, the rest is history. I think what's most remarkable about the Secretary, or Wally as he seems to be always known, is not really written on his remarkable CV. Rather, it is his humility, his willingness to engage and listen and learn, and most importantly, his ability and diligence to act. He has quickly gotten a reputation in Washington as somebody who understands the issues and can do something about them. Those two do not always coincide. He also works desperately hard, and you will see or know, gives absolutely no appearance of it. He looks completely rested at all times, as far as I can tell, even though I know he has been traveling the world to talk about some of the issues he'll be addressing you today. There's a wonderful expression from 20th century Britain. They used to say he had a really good war. I think currently what we're seeing is that Wally Adeyemo is having a good war. And it's a good thing for all of us in this country and I think around the world. And you can also see that reflected in the growing number and importance of the assignments he's receiving from the President and the Secretary, also by his presence on the shows on Sunday morning when you watch. But today's Tuesday afternoon, and we're lucky enough to have him, so let me turn it over to the Deputy Secretary.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and it's great to be with you today. And I appreciate having a chance to speak to all of you about where things stand with the U.S. economy and where we go from here, especially in light of the administration's recent legislative achievements. These accomplishments build on lessons history has taught us, which is that when it comes to our greatest challenges, close collaboration between the public and private sector is essential. From the rapid development of a COVID vaccine using breakthrough medical technology to the public-private partnerships in distributing critical medical and economic assistance to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic, our greatest successes have often been born from our shared endeavors. This partnership has dramatically changed the course of the pandemic in the United States, and combined with the grit and determination of the American people, contributed to an historic economic recovery. Over the course of the President's first 20 months in office, we have vaccinated 77% of American adults, and we have added nearly 10 million jobs. These new jobs have put total employment ahead of where it was even before the pandemic. And with this new legislation, we have the tools we need to continue building a more equitable, sustainable, and strong American economy for the future. Still, as you all well know, our economic environment is not without challenges. The pandemic and Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine have caused significant economic shocks that are contributing to elevated price levels in the U.S. and across the developed world. The President has made clear that the administration's top priority is the fight against inflation. The Fed, of course, has primary responsibility for addressing inflation, and the President has clearly stated his commitment to supporting the Fed's independence. But in addition to that, the administration is taking proactive action. The President's economic strategy is designed to help bring down inflation by addressing supply-side constraints and expanding our economy's productive capacity. This approach reflects what Secretary Yellen has called modern supply-side economics, which prioritizes expanding the labor supply and investing in human capital, public infrastructure, R&D, and clean technologies. These investments aren't just about accelerating the kind of economic growth we already have in this country. They are designed to bring economic opportunity to Americans that have not had the resources they need to fully participate in and benefit from our nation's economic prosperity. They will increase the productive capacity of the United States through investments in universal broadband and putting more jobs within the reach through expansion of our transportation infrastructure. They will position us to lead in the most cutting-edge industries of today, like semiconductors, and address the supply constraints that have held us back in recent years. And they will help ensure we are at the forefront of the industries of tomorrow, especially when it comes to the clean energy transition, through investments that will spur new innovation. That is what we mean by expanding our economy's productive capacity. In many ways, the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act exemplifies this strategy. The IRA will help reduce costs and give us the means to address our economy's most critical long-term needs, from investing in clean technology to combating climate change, to funding for health care that will support the well-being of millions of Americans, to deficit reduction that will secure a stable economic future for our country. This legislative win builds on recently passed bipartisan infrastructure law and the CHIPS Act, which will invest $52 billion in American semiconductor manufacturing. These actions are already changing our economy for the better. Spurred by the CHIPS Act, U.S. companies have already announced nearly $50 billion of investments in American chip making, which will create jobs and make our supply chains more resilient. Of course, these legislative accomplishments will not transform our economy simply because they change the laws on our books. They require detailed and careful implementation and close coordination with the private sector, institutions like yours that will, in many cases, provide additional resources to help turn these federal investments into innovations that accelerate economic growth. Today, I want to mention 3 places that I am particularly focused on where public-private partnership will be essential. The first is financing the clean energy transition. The IRA is the boldest investment in American history when it comes to tackling the climate crisis, with a $370 billion investment in a green future. For context, when adjusted for inflation, this investment is twice as large as the Marshall Plan for Europe after World War II. This investment will create tens of thousands of new jobs, green manufacturing jobs. It will help consumers buy greener appliances and weatherize their homes, and it will offer new incentives to build electric vehicles in America and for Americans to use them. The sum total of these actions will be an economy that is cleaner, stronger, and poised to lead the global climate transition. According to some initial estimates, the IRA will drive investments totaling $3 trillion in new American low-carbon energy infrastructure over the next decade. We know that there's no way to fully finance this transition and ultimately become a net zero economy without the active participation of the private sector, especially the financial institutions in this room. We applaud those of you who have made net zero commitments with clear interim targets and encourage you to move ambitiously to turn these commitments into action. And for those of you still waiting, we urge you to more carefully evaluate the climate risk associated with your portfolios, as well as to take steps to help finance this transition. The direction of policy and regulatory travel, both here in the United States and globally, have never been clearer. The second area where I think we can work in partnership is work to reduce economic inequality. Economic inequality, as you all know, is a threat to our country's economic prosperity. Generations of intentional and unintentional economic exclusion and underinvestment have hampered progress for underserved communities throughout this country, including communities of color, rural communities, and others left behind or left out. The resulting concentration of wealth and opportunity in our country not only shatters faith in our institutions, it also limits the ability of marginalized communities to contribute to America's economic potential and holds back economic growth for all Americans. While economic inequality is an issue that impacts Americans of all races and creeds, as you all know, the impact is especially concentrated within communities of color. We need to work together across the public and private sector to unlock this potential, which will benefit all Americans. That's why I'm encouraged by the launch of the Economic Opportunity Coalition, which Vice President Harris announced just across the bridge in Brooklyn weeks ago. The EOC brings together more than 24 companies and foundations who are committed to expanding access to capital and economic opportunity in underserved communities in ways that augment the investments that are being made by the federal government. A number of its founding members, including Citi, PayPal, Bank of America, Goldman, PNC, Capital One, MasterCard, Discover, and BNY Mellon, are here with us today. and I encourage those of you who are not members to speak with them about this work. Already, this coalition has committed tens of billions of dollars to support CDFIs and MDIs, expand access to financial products, and invest in communities and workforce training across the country. I will mention just one example of where this partnership is already benefiting marginalized communities. Last year, the federal government announced historic investments through the Emergency Capital Injection Program of $9 billion in minority-owned depository institutions and CDFIs, which will help them invest in marginalized communities throughout this country. And now, these institutions need deposits to maintain their equity to asset ratios. This is one of several needs the EOC is focused on helping to meet, and a place where all of the institutions in this room can play a role. We look forward to working with the EOC and others in this room in a true public-private partnership to expand opportunity to marginalized communities all over the country. The final place where I look forward to our continued partnership is implementing sanctions to hold Russia accountable for their unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. In response to the sanctions and export controls put in place by more than 30 countries, your institutions have taken decisive actions to implement these restrictions, and I know many of you have enhanced your due diligence to ensure that Russia can evade these sanctions. These unprecedented actions were not taken lightly, as you all know. They were implemented in response to Russia's blatant violation of sovereignty of another nation and their destabilizing activity in the region, which is contributing to elevated global food and energy prices. We know that so far Russia has been able to finance this brutal war using revenues from commodity sales. The G7 is focused on taking steps to reduce these revenues that help to finance Russia's invasion. The price cap proposal that the G7 finance ministers announced last Friday helps accomplish this objective by allowing Russian oil to continue to flow onto the global market using services provided by the G7, provided it is sold at or below the capped price. In order for the price cap to be effective, we need service providers, especially those providing financial services, to help with implementation. We want to work with you to design a compliance regime that is simple and is possible to implement and helps to accomplish our objectives. This will help prevent damaging energy price spikes while reducing Russia's most critical resource and its revenues. One reason we believe the price cap will help achieve our goal of reducing the Kremlin's revenues is because it can succeed even if a number of oil importers did not choose to formally join our price cap coalition. These countries want to pay lower prices for Russian oil, and the price cap will help them achieve that by offering greater transparency into what price coalition members are paying. In turn, that transparency will give importing countries leverage to drive better deals with Russia, a phenomenon where all countries except Russia win, in which their revenues are lessened and the price that these countries are paying is lower. That alone is enough to help accomplish our goal and, in essence, make sure that we're in a place where energy continues to flow while Russia's revenues decrease. Before I conclude, let me go back to where I started. We face economic challenges, but we're better positioned than any country in the world to manage them. And I am even more confident about the outlook for the U.S. economy in light of recent congressional action. With these tools, we have what we need to make the most of this pivotal economic moment, position America to lead when it comes to the clean energy economy, 21st century manufacturing, and the industries of the future and beyond. And while we have a great deal of work ahead of us to ensure these programs are implemented as effectively as possible, we know the path set by the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, and the President's other legislative accomplishments is one that will lead to a brighter future for the American economy and our people. And we look forward to working with you to make sure this future is a reality. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for that. I'll start with the questions and then see if I can figure out how the works. I know you've actually been spending a lot of time traveling the world in support of this effort to cap prices for Russian oil. And I think as economists, bankers, with lots of questions, because it's a very complicated thing to administer the price cap. So just some more details. I actually understand that insurance is the lever. So sort of how does that work? And then I guess the next question would just be, how much participation do you need to get? What's the tipping point where this will actually be effective?
I appreciate the question. I appreciate you having me here. I really enjoy the fact that your organization has done a great job of building a public-private partnership, and more than anything, a dialogue about how we can make sure that we're focused on the things that matter to grow our economy. One of the challenges we face today is headline inflation. Energy prices are far higher than they should be because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What we're attempting to do is to deny Russia the price cap is a tool in doing that. The way the price cap is intended to work is to tell Russia that they can't use G7 services at large to be able to move seaborne Russian oil going forward unless it is sold below the price cap. So while insurance is one of those services, it's only one of them. We expect trade finance and all of the other financial services and a number of other services to play a role here in making sure that we're able to enforce these sanctions going forward. And what we've decided to do is set up a system of attestation, where the person who is taking on board the Russian oil onto the boat needs to have an attestation from the company that is, for example, providing trade finance or others who are providing insurance in order to make sure that the Russian oil that is being loaded, that is being insured by a Western company, is below the price cap. And ultimately, the reason we think that this will work is because the incentives of the purchasers are similar to the incentives of the G7 countries that are providing the services, which is to pay the lowest possible amount for Russian oil. So the idea here is to make sure that we are providing an avenue for that to happen. Russia may go out and procure its own services, but as all of you know in this room who offer services for the transport of oil or for any good and service, the idea that you're doing a volume business helps you bring your prices down. And if Russia goes out and finds services and everyone who is providing those services know that they don't have an alternative, our theory is that that would make it more expensive for Russia to build an alternative ecosystem. In addition to that, by being transparent about the price that we would pay within the price cap coalition, which we are committed to making above Russia's price of production, it will mean that those countries that may not join the coalition will have better negotiating power against Russia, which will help us meet our ultimate goal, which will mean that Russia revenues go down.
So how many, who's in the price cap coalition now? And again, how many do you need to get in to get this sort of virtuous cycle where even those who are not in will be able to negotiate tougher with Russia?
So the G7 have officially, as of Friday, the finance minister said we are going to implement this. I'd expect in the coming weeks that we'll see other countries joining. I don't want to get ahead of them being able to publicly announce themselves. In terms of what it would take, we are hoping to build a coalition that includes service providers, because ultimately the thing about oil is you got to get it somewhere, and especially on the seaboard. And the more service providers that come on board, the higher the cost and the more difficulty Russia will have in terms of moving seaborne oil without those service providers. But we also want to get importers on board as well. Not many G7 countries are going to continue to import Russian oil. In the United States, banned the import. So we've worked with a number of countries, and we've had conversations. And I know that just the other day, the Indian trade minister said they're considering this and looking at it. And our conversations, a number of other countries have said the same. And as we put out more details, they want to consider it, because ultimately what these countries all want is to pay as little as possible for energy going forward. And what's happened today is that because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you have a huge risk premium that's in the market. And our goal needs to be to make sure that Russia doesn't benefit from that risk premium.
Now, this seems already to have provoked a reaction with regard to natural gas as Russia's cut off foreign stream. Do we think those two are related, and how does it sort of interrelate as an economic matter?
So I can't tell you what or how the Kremlin thinks about energy, but I think what is happening with natural gas should make any country that is purchasing anything from Russia realize that Russia may not be ultimately a reliable supplier. And I think that for Russia, what we know today is that because of the sanctions and export controls we've put in place, Russia's economy is going to shrink this year and is likely going to shrink even more in future years, because not only have we put sanctions on their financial sector, but we've put sanctions and export controls on key technologies that are critical to their economy going forward and to the potential of their economy. So Russia is in a place where they need the energy revenues that they're earning even more than they did a year ago. So they have incentives to continue to try and sell. But I do think that they're going to find that the market for people who are going to buy is going to be a more difficult one, because people are going to cut much more aggressive deals that will reduce the revenues going forward.
Well, and to that point, and this is an obvious question, I mean, it seems like this is a pretty good deal for China. in the sense that they're now going to have probably an unlimited supply of Russian oil at cost plus pricing, thanks to the beneficence of the G7. Is that an accurate assessment, and are we concerned that Russia's loss will be China's gain?
Our view is that we in the G7 have made the decision to no longer buy Russian energy because we don't want to be strategically beholden to them. Ultimately, what we hope is that developing economies throughout the world, those who have been hit the hardest by Russia's invasion, countries in Africa, small countries in Asia, countries in Latin America, will get access to this relatively cheap Russian energy by participating in the price cap coalition, and that other countries will allow them to purchase it. Because when you look at the impact that Russia's invasion has had on energy prices and on food, it is not only hurting countries in Europe, it's hurting poor countries and rich countries all over the world. So our hope is that countries like China and India will join the price cap coalition or take advantage of the price cap coalition to help to lower the amount of money they pay Russia in terms of oil, but that given the amount of oil that Russia produces, some of that oil will get to developing economies who can take advantage of it. In terms of China and their purchases of Russian oil, as long as they are doing it in a way that is mindful of our sanctions regime, China has the ability to purchase Russian oil. Fundamentally, China, like any other country, doesn't want to be beholden to one supplier. And China also realizes that Russia may not be the most reliable supplier given what's happening in Europe with gas right now.
Fascinating. I mean, it's a little bit of a tangent, and maybe not in your department, although everything seems to be in your department. You mentioned food. I mean, there's clearly already and certainly to come sort of a global food crisis as a result of the loss of the Ukrainian, a large percentage of the Ukrainian harvest. Is there a coalition coming on that? And what's the strategic interest of the U.S. there, and how are we addressing it?
Yeah, I think that the elevated food prices we're seeing today, again, are tied to what's happening in Ukraine, as you said. I think we're encouraged by the deal that has allowed Ukrainian grain to leave Ukraine. But something that people should recognize is that what Russia is doing on gas in Europe is going to hurt the ability of European companies to produce fertilizer. And what that's going to do is that in 2023, that's going to have a huge impact again on food. And it's going to have an impact that's going to matter to these developing economies again more than it's going to impact us, where we'll be able to pay for it even though prices will be elevated. And one of the things that we're focused on is making sure that working with the World Bank, the international multilateral development banks, to make sure that we provide fiscal resources to these countries so they have the financial resources to help them mitigate these challenges. But ultimately, the thing that we need to do is increase supply. I think we're taking steps in the United States to do that. The Department of Agriculture is leading those efforts. As I mentioned, we've taken steps to make sure that Ukrainian grain is getting safe passage through the Black Sea, which has been important. But I do think that one thing we have to look at is the supply chain. And fertilizer is going to matter a great deal. And what Russia is doing in terms of strategically turning gas into a weapon is going to have an impact on the ability of fertilizer to be produced in Europe. And that's going to have an impact on prices of food, not only in Europe, but around the world, given how important fertilizer is. So we're focused on this. We're trying to make sure we have financial resources that can go to countries that need it. But in addition to doing that, doing things that we can here in the United States and around the world to increase supply.
Fascinating. So I mean, the price cap on oil, I think, is only one arrow in the larger quiver, sanction quiver, whatever. I think depending on who you listen to, what you read, the sanctions are bringing the Russians to their knees and making them sorry, or the sanctions are not having any particular effect because they're making so much money. Maybe this is an overlap. Making so much money on oil, they've internalized their economy. They can really be fairly self-sufficient, make plenty of vodka. So, we're sort of where on the spectrum are you?
Yeah, I think to step back for a moment, I think in the beginning of the Biden administration, Secretary Yellen asked me to do a review of sanctions policy over the last 20 years since the modernization of sanctions during 9/11. And that review gave me an opportunity to talk to a number of our allies and partners about what works and what doesn't work when it comes to sanctions. And it was very helpful to have done that review that ended in October. especially in November when the president went to the secretary and said, I need you to think about what sanctions we put on Russia because we just picked up those conversations with those allies and partners. I think one of the most important things that we learned from that is that we need to have very clear objectives about what we're trying to accomplish with sanctions. And with regard to Russia, we have two objectives. One is to reduce their revenues so that they have less money to prop up their economy and less money to project power in Ukraine and elsewhere. And the second one is to go after their supply chains in order to limit the amount of things they can buy with whatever revenues they have that can further their ability to project power in Ukraine. I think today there was reporting on an internal report from Russia that was done by their economists, which demonstrated that they expect not only a recession this year, but that they won't be able to return to pre-2021 levels for over a decade because of the sanctions that were put in place. In addition to the economic revenue impact, you're seeing an impact on their ability to produce things like tanks. Their top two tank producers are no longer in business because they can't get the supplies they need to produce those tanks. They're moving from using precision missiles to using older missiles, is what reports have shown, because they can't get access to the semiconductors they need to build precision missiles. So they're having an effect on Russia. The thing we want to do is further drive that effect by further reducing their revenues in order to make the choices starker for the Kremlin between propping up their economy with revenues and continuing their illegitimate invasion.
Somewhat related question. I mean, I think a lot of folks view the Russian sanctions as almost a test run for China, in the sense that they are similar regional adventurism. This is the sort of thing they would face. So, I mean, do you think that the Russian experience has given them pause, or do you think it's sort of given the West pause in terms of when you think about how difficult it has been and how many trips have had to be made just to implement sanctions against what's really economically not that very large a country, and what it would need to disentangle from China?
So I'm not going to speak to how the Chinese think about policy, but what I will say from our perspective, and again from the sanctions review, is that ultimately our goal is not to implement sanctions. Sanctions is a tool in service of a larger foreign policy objective. I think that in meeting those foreign policy objectives, the first thing we always want to do is figure out a path for diplomacy. And part of that diplomacy is talking about what we would do if diplomacy fails. And one of those tools is always going to be the economic consequences. And even before we put in place sanctions on Russia, financial markets reacted to the uncertainty that Russia had created. We do not have sanctions on food. Yet food prices are elevated today because of Russia's invasion in Ukraine. And the truth is that when a country decides to invade another sovereign country and to create the type of risk that that brings to the international order, it's going to spill into markets, and it's not only going to impact their neighbor who they've invaded, it's going to impact the globe. And that's what we're seeing in Africa and Latin America and Asia today, that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is having a negative impact on those economies. So our overarching goal when it comes to Russia and Ukraine is to end that invasion. And that's what we're using these tools to do. And ultimately, as we consider the use of sanctions going forward, our goal will always be to use them in a way that both allows us to further our foreign policy objective, but also in a way that allows them to be reversible. Because if someone changes behavior, we want to be able to potentially roll out those sanctions.
And another related question, I think based on our earlier conversation, I think I know the answer to this, but I mean, I think there are some who suggest that, and we're even suggesting before this episode, that the U.S. was overusing economic sanctions back to the Bush administration, and that was somehow going to undermine the role of the dollar as the global reserve currency. How large a threat do you see from that?
I am not worried about the role of the dollar as the global reserve currency. I think in my speech, I outlined a number of reasons why. Given the investments we're making in our economy, given the depth and liquidity of our markets, given that we have the world's best infrastructure, best infrastructure for technology and technology improvements, and the legislation that we have in place now, I feel confident about the dollar's role. Ultimately, the thing that's going to drive the dollar's role is, do people want to invest in America? I do think that if we don't use sanctions judiciously, I do worry about unintended consequences, and I think that's what the sanctions review spoke to, and the idea being that sanctions should always be used in service of a foreign policy policy strategy. We should make sure that we do rigorous economic analysis before using them. And whenever possible, we should do them in a multilateral way. If we do the things that are in that review going forward, I think that we'll be in a place where this tool will be able to be used for decades to come. But the key thing from my standpoint in terms of the dollars to be equal and the United States to be equal in the world is going to be us making the right investments in America, which the CHIPS Act, the Infrastructure Bill, and the Investment and the Inflation Reduction Act, I think gives us the tools to do. If we do those things well, I'm confident about the future of the dollar.
Agree. I actually, next time you ask, I'll add a couple more. We have the rule of law. We don't impose capital controls. And, and I think somewhat relevant here, especially with clearinghouse, the fact that the Fed made trillions of dollars available through stock markets in 2009, 2020, that's how you get to the reserve currency. I should add, the clearinghouse was co-litigating with the Fed in a FOIA lawsuit to try to keep that secret because they knew they were going to get a lot of grief for it. But anyway, they did that for America. I think I was just told 5 minutes, is that correct? Jeez, I haven't gotten any of my questions. This is so much fun. I did want to ask you about the Economic Opportunity Coalition, just to say a little more about that. I was very pleased and proud to hear that so many of our members are participating in that. Can others join? Also, we had a wonderful interaction. We had our CEOs in town this spring. I had the National Bankers Association's membership come in and meet with them. And I think a lot of the ideas of the type that you were talking about, triggering deposits, were raised. But just maybe a little more on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to say something about that. I want to make clear that all of your members I know are doing a great deal in this space already. I think the thing that I found encouraging about the Economic Opportunity Coalition has been the idea that they want to work alongside the federal government to crowd in private investment alongside the public investment that's already been made in a number of these communities. And in some cases, we've done some of the underwriting. For example, the CDFIs. We've done a bunch of underwriting there already before we made our investments, and we know what kind of help they potentially need. But there are other areas when it comes to the bipartisan infrastructure bill where we think that getting the private sector to invest alongside the federal government will help us build a far more beneficial ecosystem for these marginalized communities going forward. The EOC is a private sector-led initiative. A number of your lead institutions in your group are leaders. I'd recommend that any institution that's interested think about joining. I think it's we found it as the federal government to be a good platform for us exchanging ideas. And I think one of the things that the members of the EOC have also done is pushed us in terms of working better together across federal agencies to make sure that we're making clear where the opportunities lie for the private sector to participate alongside the federal government. And it's something that we're going to do more. But my view is that inequality is an issue that cannot be solved only by the government, even though we have to take a lead here. It's going to require all of us to play a role. And ultimately, the reason I think this is in everyone's self-interest is it's about unlocking the unrealized potential of the American economy that exists in these communities. Before I took this job, I lived on the south side of Chicago working for President Obama, and I remember a CEO of a small firm telling me that talent exists everywhere, including here on the south side of Chicago, but opportunity doesn't. And I think that the investments that you make in communities like that is going to unlock potential in those communities and be to the benefit of the American economy.
Well, my iPad says no approved questions yet, which means either there are no questions, I don't know how to use the iPad, or somebody disapproved all the questions. But in any event, maybe I'll do one more just as an issue I know you care about, and we do, which is sort of the AML implementation. Clearly there's been a war on, so we understand that may not have been the highest priority. I think there's been a lot of focus on the beneficial ownership database. I'll leave that aside, but to us it was equally probably more important that the legislation included a mandate to Treasury to actually set priorities with regard to the vast sums and thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people in the banking industry who implement rules and often find that they are catching no bad guys as a result of what they were told to do. So where are you in that process, really more around taking leadership at Treasury, telling the banking agencies what's important and what isn't?
Yeah, and let me just start out by saying a word of thanks, because I think that as you know well, and I think most people don't, the success of the implementation of our sanctions relies a great deal on the efforts of the talented compliance officials that work for each one of you. And I think that when it's come to Russian sanctions, we've done a great job in terms of implementation and helping prevent litigation. And I think it's reasonable to expect that we would also set out a set of priorities in terms of what we think is critical and important, and we're going to do that work. But I think the thing I will say is that one of the things that I want to make clear is that innovation is going to change that prioritization rapidly and over time. So I think that while we're doing the work to make sure that we're providing you with the priorities that we see today, we're going to need to work together in the same partnership we just talked about to revise that as, because as you know, these individuals who are looking for ways to move money illicitly, what they will do is they'll look for any hole or any gap in the system. Crypto, sorry. To try and evade our sanctions. And we're going to want to make sure that we work together to make sure that doesn't happen. I think you mentioned an issue there where I think that from our perspective, one of the things we think through is how do we build a regulatory architecture that captures some of these means that allow people to get outside the traditional banking sector to try and move money illicitly. So I think, again, we're working to do just that in terms of providing more information about our priorities. But I want to be clear that even if we come up with a list of priorities, that's going to change over time in light of innovations like the one you mentioned.
Wasn't me. I think we're at time. Yes, thank you so much. That was so much fun.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our session. Please join us in the continued